Thank you all for coming out tonight for the public forum, Stories About Migration. My name is Byron Santangelo. I am serving as the director of the Kansas African Studies Center at KU, and I'm a professor of English and Environmental Studies. This forum is a central component of a larger project focused on facilitating the creation and spread of stories about African immigration in the Midwest and the U.S. more generally. The hope is that the project will highlight the value of stories for productive dialogue and the value of sharing stories for reframing public discussions about immigration. The questions that we're focused on are: what are different stories about immigration, and how can those stories be accessed? How can stories that have been unheard be made accessible? How might stories enable productive dialogue and the production of more stories? And how do people's stories about themselves change through the experience of immigration? And how do stories about the communities tell about themselves change through the process or the experience of immigration? The Migration Stories project is co-directed by me and the regular director of the Kansas African Studies Center, Liz McGonigal. Both the Migration Stories project and this forum are funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of their Humanities in the Public Square initiative. This initiative is intended to draw on the humanities as a means to enable community dialogue about pressing controversial social issues. In addition to this forum, we will be running workshops in the months to come focused on storytelling, poetry, theater, and the visual arts. And we will be working with the Kansas Humanities Council and the Kansas City Public Radio Station, KCUR, on radio shows as well as book and film discussions. And we hope that all of you will join us for some or all of these. An important part of the initiative is to collect stories about immigration, both from immigrants and from members of host communities. If you're interested in sharing your story, please visit our project website, www.migrationstories.ku.edu. Also, please make sure to fill out the evaluation form that's folded into your program. This will enable us to gather your input about the project. And in fact, part of the purpose of this forum is to help us formulate the direction for Migration Stories. Also, on the evaluation form, there's a place for your email address. And if you have a story and want to tell it, please make sure to fill in your email address and then also indicate that you'd like to share a story so that we can get in touch with you. Our program will begin about the first hour with 3 presentations by our speakers, Marta Caminero-Santangelo, Garth Myers, and Chris Abani. The second half of the program, which should run from about 8 till 9, will focus on questions and comments for the audience. And what we're hoping is that this will actually develop into a kind of dialogue or discussion. Also, we have an audience that's in Garden City, Kansas, that we're teleconferencing with, and they will sometimes be up on the screen. And they will also be able to ask questions and comments at the end during the question and answer period. So our first speaker today is Marta Caminero-Santangelo, professor of English at KU, working on issues of Latino migrant experiences and human rights. She's been designated a KU Woman of Distinction and received a prestigious Kemper Fellowship for teaching excellence at KU. She's the author of 3 books and numerous articles. Her most recent book, Documenting the Undocumented, Latino Narratives and Social Justice in the Era of Operation Gatekeeper from the University of Florida Press, focuses on the ways that writers express solidarity with undocumented immigrants. Documenting the Undocumented also focuses on bringing immigrant voices that have been silenced back into debates about immigration. Today she's going to be speaking to us about how migrants redefine what it means to be American by telling distinctly American stories. Please join me in welcoming Marta.
Everybody, I'm so happy to be here. And thank you all for coming. I'm the lucky one who gets to go first. So as a way of opening up this conversation and tagging along to what Byron just said, I'd really like to focus on the importance of telling stories for political and social work. I'm a lit professor, so stories are what I do. And I'd like to start out by just pointing out that there's been quite a bit of scholarship recently that points out that activism and human rights really depend on the telling of stories, on oral histories, testimonies, life stories, because precisely they give a face, they give some concrete reality to issues that can otherwise seem really abstract and complex. But once you start talking about storytelling for activism, you get pretty quickly to the question of who gets to tell the story. And my research, as Byron said, focuses on Latino studies, and in the past several years, it's focused very specifically on stories about undocumented immigration. And so I'm hoping today to use that as a case study for sort of looking at the political and social power of stories. But as you might guess, historically, the undocumented aren't necessarily the first group that comes to mind as wanting to tell their stories for political and social activism, because you risk pretty immediately the threat of deportation if you tell your story openly. And also, when we think of the public square or the public sphere, there's no particular official platform, there's no particular venue for undocumented immigrants to tell their stories publicly and be heard. So there's no particular outlet for undocumented immigrants to tell their stories and have a hearing. But today I want to talk about dream activists, they call themselves dreamers, who are probably the most vocal group of undocumented immigrants thus far to come out and actually tell their stories. And they're the most politically savvy about the power of storytelling. And just in case you're not super familiar with the DREAM Act, versions of which have been proposed since 2001, the basic premise is that it would give an avenue of legalization and perhaps eventual citizenship for undocumented immigrants who came here as children, have lived here many years, have established a good character, graduate from high school or get their GED, and then spend at least 2 years in college or in military service. There have been various versions over the years, but they all basically maintain these parameters. Just to give you a sense of how African immigration fits into this, we tend to think of undocumented immigration as largely a Latino, Latin American issue, and it is a majority Latino, Latin American issue, but of course undocumented immigrants come from a wide variety of countries and regions. This is the population, as far as I could find, of estimated African undocumented immigrants in the U.S., and then the population that's eligible for DACA, which is deferred, I'm forgetting what the acronym is.
Deferred action.
Deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is Obama's policy of temporarily forestalling deportation for basically people who would have qualified for the DREAM Act. So if you came here as a child, you've been here with continuous presence in the U.S. and so on, you can qualify for deferred action for 2 years, renewable. But it's a policy, it's not a law, so if somebody other than Obama got to be president, who knows what would happen. But the population eligible for DACA is roughly the same as the population of people who would be eligible for the DREAM Act. So you can see that that's the percentage of total African undocumented immigrants. And in case you're interested, there's a breakdown of Kansas and Missouri undocumented immigrants. The issue as undocumented activists, dream activists, tell their stories is that they're really emphasizing, first of all, representing themselves and telling their own stories in response to, a decade and a half of deportations. During the era of George W. Bush, there were large-scale workplace raids, and they really want to emphasize the issue of telling their own stories for political effect. I interviewed several dreamers in 2010, 2011, and I want to read you some of their words. Tamara says, "It wasn't until I started organizing with a group of undocumented people that I realized that what was missing from my organizing before was a clear perspective that it should be undocumented people who are at the head of the movement. Because the group that I'm in now and that I helped start is precisely a group where we want to say that it's about undocumented young people leading and their decisions, our decisions, being respected." So you can kind of hear in Tamara's words that she's insisting on taking back the public square, that if the public square is a place where undocumented immigrants haven't been given a voice or been given a platform where they can be heard, Tamara really wants to insist, no, you really need to listen to us. We're the ones who know about our situation and can best tell our stories. And another undocumented immigrant that I interviewed, Cesar, said pretty much the same general theme. "Many don't understand why we come to this country in the first place or the root causes of migration, and they don't hear enough about stories such as mine. They don't understand. Just seeing around that age," and he's talking about high school, "seeing around that age the things on the media, I just knew that this isn't right. And I knew that as immigrants, wait a minute, where's our voice in this whole everything that's going on?" And so that's when I decided, you know what? I need to share my story, because it's stories like mine that will change people's minds and hearts. And so undocumented immigrant dreamers, one of their slogans is "coming out of the shadows." Another is "undocumented and unafraid." And the basic idea is that you declare your undocumented status openly, you tell your story and you identify yourself for political purposes, and you tell it in as many venues as you possibly can. So there are websites, there are videos on YouTube, some of which I'm going to share with you, there are blogs, they share their stories on social media. The basic idea is really to tell your story as a form of political activism. This is a poster that was put out by the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, which also has put out a guide to coming out that used to be available on the web. And the guide would sort of outline various different levels at which you could tell your story for undocumented immigrant dreamers, would-be dreamers. And basically say, look, we're a community, we're here, you're not alone, there's more than one of you, we can offer support, we can offer guidelines, come out and tell your story. And then there were various different levels at which you could tell your story, starting with, friends and family, immediate community members, and then going on to, for example, level 4 is a rally. And every year since about 2002, undocumented immigrants from across the nation have been showing up in Washington, D.C. In June to protest and rally and advocate for the DREAM Act. These are some pictures I took, I believe it was June 2009 or 10 when I was in Washington, D.C. They hold mock graduations to call attention to the fact that they graduate from high school, but then many of them cannot afford to attend college because they're not eligible for financial aid, or often for in-state tuition, depending on what state they're in. This is a Dream Activist website, so there are various websites that solicit Dream Activist stories, tell them, tell your story here. And this one is put out by, among other people, Jose Antonio Vargas, who is perhaps the most prominent undocumented immigrant in the U.S., currently telling his story, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. They've collected their stories in volumes such as this one, Papers, Stories by Undocumented Youth, and they've also created documentaries. This is the companion documentary. And in March of this year, they actually presented an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. So you can see that Dream Activists really see their stories, their personal stories, as being told for political purposes. But because of that, they're often focusing on what is common to dreamers, to undocumented youth. So their stories tend, as they develop and as they get repeated, to focus on elements that are common to the struggle, rather than so much the differences. So differences of national origin don't get emphasized. What gets emphasized is things like the obstacles that hold them back, when they realize they're undocumented, what they hoped to do, what they can't do, and the common group identity among them. They identify, I would venture a generalization, that they identify publicly, first and foremost, as dreamers, rather than as Mexican, Venezuelan, African. One woman, Katrina, that I interviewed, who is actually an immigrant from Nigeria who came to the U.S. when she was 5 or 6 years old, described her process this way. In junior year of high school, we started to take our first advanced placement tests and things like that, and the college discussion started. So I looked up their applications, and then I noticed they had your basic identification information, but then they also had, for citizenship status, it was, are you a citizen, are you a permanent resident, or are you an international student? And those were the only 3 options. And our family had never really talked about immigration stuff. All I knew was our immigration status was pending. That's all I'd been told. That's all I really knew. So with that application, I was just like, well, I'm not really in any category, and there's no other box. So it seems like from hearing other dreamer stories, it's the moment that you kind of realize you're a dreamer, even though you don't know you're a dreamer yet, and you don't call it being a dreamer, it's still kind of the first time that most of us are just like, well, there is no box for me, so I don't really know what to do. And maybe you can hear in her words how she's really emphasizing the formation of a group identity even before she really knew that it was a group identity. What she's emphasizing is the commonality of experience, and in retrospect, the group identity gives her a vocabulary to talk about that experience. I'm going to show you 2 videos that are available on YouTube just to sort of underscore the potential commonalities of the story, despite wide varieties of national origin and culture. The first one is Carlos, who immigrated from Venezuela.
I'm America. I am America.
I am America. I am America. I am America. I am America.
I am America.
I am America. We are America. My name is Carlos Roa, and I am America. My family and myself came to the United States back in 1989. I was only 2 years old. My grandfather came to this country in 1948. U.S. citizen since 1958, and he had the opportunity to realize his American dream. My dad tried year after year to get us legalized and spent tens of thousands of dollars with lawyers, and still nothing. It's been 20 years. People think it's as easy as just getting behind the line. It's not like that. I feel bad about it because it's like, how is it possible, that people like my father are still undocumented? Having a father that was a U.S. citizen for over 40 years. I graduated in 2005 from high school, and I wanted to get into college. I wanted to join the military, and those options I couldn't do any of that. And so it's frustrating, the fact that I want to give back. I'm willing to serve this country in military service, and I don't even have the option to do so. When you're shooting down people's dreams, that's bad, and it's bad for everyone, not just immigrants. It was very difficult for her. She fought 2 battles. One of them being having breast cancer, and the other, the fact that she was, that her family was undocumented. It was really tough for her as a mother, raising 3 kids and not being able to get legalized in this country. All she wanted to do was provide for us, provide for her family, as any other family in this country, and be able to. And she wanted us to realize, our American dream. She wanted to see her kids become professionals. The fact that she was such a fighter, that has influenced me throughout my life, and it has everything I do it in her memory. If you work hard, and if you try, and you strive, you can realize your potential, and you could be a contributing member to society. It's something that this country has prided itself on. And
Okay, just for time's sake, I'll go on to the next one. This is Tolu Olubunmi, who is Nigerian and came to the United States when she was 14. You can maybe pick up some of the same elements from her story.
My name is Tolu Olubunmi. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, to two of the most hardworking, devoted parents anyone could ask for. When I was 14 years old, I was brought to the U.S. To escape the increasingly erratic political climate in Nigeria, but never with the intention of becoming undocumented or living within the confines of the U.S. for the past 16 years. I graduated high school at the top of my class, and when it came time to apply for college, I could barely afford the application fee, let alone tuition, but I didn't let this deter me from my goals. You see, my father had always taught me that an education is a basic necessity in life, and a college education as vital as learning your ABCs. And so with his support, I pushed forward and earned a full scholarship to one of the nation's top universities. I knew I'd been blessed, and I took full advantage of this tremendous opportunity. I'd wanted to be an engineer since I was 8 years old, and in 2002, I graduated with a chemical engineering degree, ready to fulfill my childhood dream. It's been nearly 10 years since graduation, and I'm yet to work a day as an engineer. The only thing worse than having your dreams dashed or being rejected by my own country is losing my father and not being able to say goodbye. My father passed away in Nigeria in the fall of 2006. During his last visit to the U.S. in the summer of 2006, I found out that my father often spent days weeping over my situation, not knowing how to help me. I've always known that my father loved me, but the depth of his love was magnified during our last few weeks together. He knew how hard I'd worked to become an engineer and the many dreams I had for my future. He felt my pain as deeply, the pain of my lost dreams as deeply as I did. And so he did the only thing he knew how to do, cry to God on my behalf. It's difficult, nearly impossible to put into words, having to make a choice between saying goodbye to my father and being able to return to the U.S. 3 weeks after my last visit with my father, he passed away, and I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to say goodbye to the best man I've ever known, the one who sacrificed everything to give me and my siblings a shot at a better life. Nor was I able to be there for my mother, who just lost her husband and her best friend. You see, attending my father's funeral meant being torn away from my friends, family, and the life I've built for the past 16 years. It's been nearly 5 years since he passed away. But his voicemail is still saved. His phone number is still on my phone. His face still so fresh in my heart. And I dream about him often, and I'm still convinced that he'll come visit over the summer, like he's done every year since I was 14. Too many young people like me are carrying burdens that we were never meant to carry. I was nearly broken under the weight of my undocumented status. But after meeting so many others like me, and seeing the passion with which Senator Durbin and other legislators and advocates fight for my future, I decided to stop carrying the pain and shame of a decision I had no control over. You see, the dreams of my youth have stalled, yes, but my country still needs me. So I volunteer full-time to ensure a better future for thousands others.
And here you can see Tolu Olubunmi introducing Obama actually at a White House event in 2013 for immigration reform. So once again, these stories really have had a lot of influence on Obama, on policy, and they've been quite persuasive with some politicians for the DREAM Act. Maybe you could hear some of the similarities in their stories. They both focus on lack of criminal intent and legitimate ties to the U.S. Carlos's grandfather was an American citizen. Tolu says, we came here, but we had no intention of being undocumented. They focus on issues of merit, Carlos, and on wanting to give back to American society. So Carlos wanted to enlist in the military, and Tolu wanted to be an engineer. They really want to contribute meaningfully, but their goals and ambitions are thwarted because of their status. And then they also focus, instead of focusing on a narrative of their family members making an illegal decision, they focus on family sacrifice and the things that their family had to give up for them to be here, including in Tolu's case, not being able to go back to be with her father when he died. This last one is also a Nigerian immigrant and a leader in the DREAM activist movement, Kemi Bello, and it takes a slightly different tone. I'll have to advance a little bit for this one.
I realized I was undocumented my senior year in high school when I was getting ready to apply to college, and so I had to change a lot of my expectations about higher education and identification and things like that. And then the summer after high school, my family and I were put into removal proceedings, and so for the past 6 years we've been pushing back against that. You don't necessarily have to be arrested at the border. You could just be going to school and stop at a stop sign, or you could be doing something within your everyday life that's still very much puts you at risk. So it kind of goes back to the idea that all of us are at risk of deportation and detention at any given time, regardless of how under the radar you try to be, regardless of how safe you attempt to play it. There's still always that risk. So the idea of having no papers and no fear is really important. First, because we have come to a consensus, I guess, that the more out you are as undocumented, the safer you are. Partly because it's really easy within the detention system to disappear if nobody knows who you are or what your story is. They do raids or pick people up early in the morning when nobody's looking. So if something were to happen to you and nobody would know, it's really easy for you to disappear into the system and quickly be deported. Versus if people know your story, there's a community behind you, ready to support you. And so the more visible you are, the more protection that you inherently have. And I think the other has been pushing back against this idea of being in the shadows, so to speak, and have it be kind of almost like a victimizing of our stories and our experiences. Whereas it's not the lack of having papers that should make us shameful, rather us recognizing that it's a really systematic problem of various issues that lead to us not having papers to begin with.
So you could probably hear from Kemi's words that she's trying to turn around the threat of telling your story as an undocumented person, and saying, no matter how much we live in the shadows, we're always at risk. So why not tell your story? Because at least when you tell your story, people know who you are, they know your story. It's harder to disappear. And I think that's a really interesting turn on it, right? Telling your story is a way not to disappear. So I want to end with the words of James, who is another undocumented dreamer that I interviewed. And James was actually eventually able to become legalized because his stepmother was a U.S. citizen and she sponsored him. But he described for me the feeling that he had when he received his green card in the mail. And it really speaks to this issue of somehow not being recognized, not kind of being disappeared in your own country in the U.S. He says, because the day that the letter came in the mail, it's a letter that says, "Welcome to the United States of America," and it comes with your green card. And when I got that, I really only just started crying. It felt very insulting to me that only after 13, 14 years was I going to begin to be acknowledged in the country that I called home and that I loved. Thank you.